I never thought my 75th birthday would be the day my son declared me dead. I was standing in the garden at Larkridge Hollow, my hands trembling slightly as I lit the candles on the vanilla cake Iris had baked for me. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, their purple heads heavy with summer rain, and champagne glasses caught the late afternoon light like crystal promises. Callum stood across from me, his political strategist smile nowhere to be found, his eyes cold as winter. "Stones, you're dead to me," he said, his voice steady as if he were discussing quarterly reports. 3 words that shadowed 60 years of motherhood, 48 years of trying to bridge the gap his father's death had torn between us. What kind of mother loses her only child not to death or distance, but to a declaration made over birthday cake? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence after Callum's words felt like drowning in shallow water. I watched him turn and walk away from the garden party, his expensive suit cutting a sharp line through the cluster of family and friends who had come to celebrate what should have been a milestone birthday. My niece Iris rushed to my side, her documentary editor's instincts already sensing a story worth preserving. But I waved her away with a smile that felt like broken glass. I'd been a conflict mediator for 37 years. I had sat across tables from warring business partners, feuding neighbors, divorcing couples who spoke to each other only through lawyers and rage. I had learned to read the subtleties of human anger, the way it masks deeper wounds, the patterns of hurt that cycle through generations like inherited diseases. But standing there in my own garden, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been joy, I realized I had never truly mediated the most important conflict of my life, the other. Guests began to disperse with the awkward efficiency of people who had witnessed something they wished they hadn't. Vera Miro, my oldest friend, lingered by the rose bushes, her beekeeper's hands gentle on the thorny stems. At 77, she had the kind of weathered wisdom that came from decades of tending things that could sting you if you weren't careful. "That boy's been carrying poison for years," she said quietly, not looking at me directly. "Question is, Olivia, how long are you going to let him spread it around your garden?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I found myself staring at the house where Callum had grown up, where his father Thorne had written his novels in the tower study, where we had once been something resembling a family. Larkridge Hollow had been in my family for 3 generations, a sprawling Victorian estate with wraparound porches and windows that caught the changing light of the Belmer countryside. The Blue Hills rolled away from us like sleeping giants, and on clear days, you could see all the way to the old mill town where I had been born to a seamstress and a railroad worker who would have been astounded to see their daughter living in such a place. But houses, no matter how beautiful, are just containers for the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And the story I had been telling myself about my family was apparently very different from the one Callum had been carrying all these years. After the last guest had driven away, leaving only tire marks in the gravel and the lingering scent of expensive perfume, I found myself alone with Iris in the kitchen. She was washing champagne flutes with the methodical precision she brought to editing film footage, her dark hair falling in waves around her face. At 39, she had her mother's gentle stubbornness and her father's artistic eye qualities that had made her my closest confidant since her mother died when she was 12. "Aunt Leave," she said without turning around, "what really happened between you and Uncle Thorne?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. Iris had been too young to understand the complexities of her uncle's final years, the way his brilliant mind had begun to turn inward and dark, the months of silence and closed doors that had preceded his disappearance. She knew the official story, that Thorne had taken his sailboat out on Lake Meridian one October morning and never returned, that his body had been found 3 days later, that the coroner had ruled it an accidental drowning despite the note he had left in his study. What she didn't know was the content of that note, or the fact that I had been the one to find it. To read Thorne's final accounting of his failures as a husband and father, his conviction that Callum would be better off without a father whose demons had grown too large for one house to contain. She didn't know that I had made the choice to let the world believe in an accident rather than a deliberate departure, because some truths are too heavy for children to carry. But Callum had been 17 when his father died, old enough to sense the gaps in the story, old enough to wonder why his mother had seemed more relieved than devastated in the months that followed, old enough to begin building a narrative of his own about what kind of woman could move on so quickly from such a loss. "Your uncle was struggling," I said finally, setting down the dish towel I had been twisting in my hands, "with his writing, with his mind, with being a husband and father." I thought I was protecting Callum by not telling him everything, and now I'm wondering if protection and silence are the same thing, or if I've just been a coward for 30 years. That night, after Iris had driven back to her apartment in town, I sat alone in Thorne's old study. It was the one room in the house I had changed the least, still lined with his books on philosophy and literature, still dominated by the massive oak desk where he had written 3 novels that critics called luminous and unflinching, but that never sold more than a few thousand copies. His leather journal still sat in the bottom drawer, locked but not hidden, containing the thoughts he had recorded in the weeks before his death. I had read it only once, the day after his funeral, and then locked it away like evidence of a crime I wasn't sure I had committed. But tonight, with Callum's words still echoing in my ears, I opened it again. The entries began normally enough. Observations about the changing seasons, notes about a novel he was planning to write about a man who discovers he has been living someone else's life. But as the pages progressed, his handwriting became more erratic, his thoughts darker and more circular. He wrote about feeling like a fraud, about watching Callum grow into someone he could be proud of while knowing that his own influence was poison in the boy's veins. "Olivia tries to mediate between us," he had written in September, just a month before he died, "but some conflicts can't be resolved, only ended." How do you negotiate with your own inadequacy? How do you find middle ground with failure? The final entry was dated October 15th, the morning he disappeared. It was short, written in careful block letters as if he wanted to ensure it would be readable. "I have taken my love and my toxicity out of their lives. Callum will hate me for leaving, but perhaps that is cleaner than watching him hate me for staying. Oh, will understand. She always sees the long game, the greater good. Tell him I was weak, not cruel. Tell him some men are not built to be fathers, but that doesn't diminish the sons they leave behind." I closed the journal and sat in the darkness, surrounded by the whisper of old pages and the weight of 3 decades of silence. Tomorrow, I would call my lawyer. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of rewriting my will, removing Callum from inheritance, not out of spite, but out of a strange kind of love. If he believed I was dead to him, then perhaps it was time to make that legally true. But first, I had a letter to write. The morning after my birthday, I woke before dawn with a clarity that sometimes comes after devastation. The house felt different, as if Callum's declaration had shifted something fundamental in its bones. I made coffee in the kitchen where 3 generations of women had prepared meals and worried over children, where my grandmother had taught me to roll pie crust, and my mother had explained the difference between being strong and being stubborn. By the time the sun crested the blue hills, I was sitting at Thorne's desk with a legal pad and my father's fountain pen, the one he had carried through 2 wars and 30 years of railroad work. The words came slowly at first, like water from a rusty spigot, but then with increasing force. To my family, friends, and anyone who has wondered why a mother might choose to disinherit her only child, I began, my handwriting steady despite the tremor in my hands. "This letter is my accounting. I wrote about the morning Thorn disappeared. How we had found his study empty except for the journal and a cup of coffee still warm on his desk. I wrote about the 3 days of searching, the Coast Guard boats cutting white lines across Lake Meridian, the reporters who gathered like crows at the end of our driveway. I wrote about Callum, 17 and angry, demanding to know why I wasn't crying enough, why I wasn't falling apart in the way he thought a proper widow should. But most of all, I wrote about the choice I had made to keep Thorn's final thoughts private, to let the world believe in accident rather than intention. At the time, it had seemed like mercy. Callum was already struggling with his father's emotional distance, his brilliant but brutal presence that made every room feel like it might shatter at any moment. How could I add the weight of deliberate abandonment to that burden? The phone rang twice while I was writing, but I let it go to the answering machine. Iris's voice, concerned and gentle, asking if I was all right. Vera, more direct. Olivia, don't do anything foolish. Call me when you remember that revenge is a dish best served never. But this wasn't revenge. This was archaeology, the careful excavation of truth from the sediment of years. I had been raised by people who believed in the power of hard work and quiet dignity, who taught me that some things were better left unsaid. My mother had never spoken about the baby she lost between my older brother and me, and my father had never mentioned the shaking that overtook his hands after he returned from Korea. In their world, strength meant carrying your pain without complaint, protecting others from the weight of your wounds. It was a philosophy that had served me well in my career. As a mediator, I had learned to create safe spaces where people could speak their truths without destroying each other, to find the narrow path between honesty and cruelty. But I was beginning to understand that I had never applied those skills to my own family, had never created a space where Callum could safely explore his anger or I could safely examine my choices. Instead, we had both retreated into our own versions of the story. In mine, I was a widow and mother doing her best to hold things together. In his, I was a woman who had somehow engineered his father's exit from our lives, who had chosen my own comfort over his need for answers. The letter grew longer as the morning stretched toward noon. I wrote about Thorn's struggles with depression, the way his moods could transform our house from sanctuary to battlefield in the space of a conversation. I wrote about the nights I had lain awake listening to him pace the hallways, the mornings I had found him staring out windows as if waiting for someone to rescue him from his own mind. I wrote about love, to the fierce, complicated love I had felt for a man whose intelligence burned so bright it sometimes consumed everything around it. Thorn had been like lightning in a bottle, illuminating everything he touched, but impossible to hold safely. Loving him had required a kind of courage I hadn't known I possessed, and losing him had required a different kind entirely. By afternoon, I had filled 12 pages with my careful script. The letter was becoming something larger than I had intended, not just an explanation of my decision to change my will, but a meditation on the nature of family secrets and the price of protection. I thought about the clients I'd counseled over the years, how often their conflicts stemmed not from what people said to each other, but from what they withheld. I was taking a break, standing by the kitchen window and watching the afternoon light slant across the garden. When Lyle arrived, Callum's son had always been different from his father, quieter, more observant, blessed with his grandfather's artistic sensibility, but tempered by what seemed like an innate emotional intelligence. At 17, he carried his camera everywhere, documenting the world with the kind of attention that suggested he understood how quickly things could change. Naive. His voice carried the uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that reminded me painfully of Thorn at that age. "Lyle, does your father know you're here?" He told me not to come, The boy's honesty was like a small knife to the heart. He said you were. He said things yesterday that I didn't understand. I studied his face, seeing Callum's stubborn jaw, but Thorne's gentle eyes, and made a decision that would have horrified my younger self. Would you like to read something? I led him to the study and handed him the pages I had written so far. He read with the concentrated attention he brought to everything, his photographer's eye taking in not just the words, but the way my handwriting had grown more confident as the morning progressed. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully and looked at me with an expression far too mature for his 17 years. Is this why Dad hates coming here? I think your father has been carrying a story about what happened to his father, and to us, for a very long time. Sometimes stories become so much a part of us that we forget they might not be true. But this is true. This is my version of true. Your grandfather was a complicated man. Lyle, he loved you all very much, but he was also very sick in ways that weren't visible. Sometimes people make choices that seem cruel, but are actually the kindest thing they can think to do. Lyle picked up his camera, an old Nikon that had belonged to his grandfather, and took a picture of the desk with the letter spread across it. The click of the shutter seemed to punctuate something important. Are you really going to change your? Well, I am, and send this letter to everyone. I think it's time people knew what really happened here. He nodded slowly, as if processing information that would require time to fully understand. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think there's ever a right time to tell the truth? It was the kind of question that would have made his grandfather proud. The sort of moral complexity that Thorne had explored in his novels, but never quite resolved in his life. I think there are wrong times and less wrong times, I said finally. And I think I've spent 30 years waiting for the right time, only to discover it doesn't exist. That evening, after Lyle had gone home to face whatever conversation awaited him with his father, I finished the letter. The final paragraphs were the hardest to write because they required me to acknowledge my own failures alongside Thorne's struggles. I was not a perfect wife or mother, I wrote. I chose silence when perhaps truth would have served us better. I chose protection when perhaps honesty would have been kinder. But I loved you all with everything I had, and I believe that love would be enough to carry us through the worst of times. I am changing my will not to punish Callum, but to free him from any obligation to forgive me. If I am dead to him, then perhaps it is time to make that separation complete. Let this house and its memories belong to those who can still find love in its rooms. To my grandson Lyle, to my niece Iris, to my friend Vera who is always dead. Am I to be braver than I am you inherit not just property, but the responsibility to tell better stories than the ones we have been telling. Use this house as a place of truth, not silence. Fill it with conversations we were too afraid to have. And to Callum, if you are reading this, your father's death was not your fault, and neither was mine. Some wounds run so deep they become part of the landscape of a life, but they need not define the territory of the next generation. I hope someday you will understand that love and letting go is sometimes the same thing. I signed it simply, Olivia Breyer, mother, widow, keeper of difficult truths. The next morning brought rain, the kind of steady downpour that makes the whole world feel hushed and contemplative. I sat at the kitchen table with my finished letter, reading it through one final time before committing to what felt like the most consequential decision of my 75 years. The pages seemed to hold weight beyond their paper, as if the words themselves had mass and gravity. Iris arrived before 9, shaking raindrops from her dark coat and bringing with her the energy of someone who had spent the night processing information. She had inherited her mother's ability to cut straight to the heart of things, and I knew she had come with questions that wouldn't be easily deflected. Aunt Leave, you can't actually be planning to send this. She gestured toward the letter as if it were a loaded weapon. Have you thought about what this will do to Callum, to Lyle? Have you thought about what 30 years of silence has already done to them? She poured herself coffee from the pot I kept perpetually warm, a habit left over from the days when Thorn would emerge from his study at odd hours needing caffeine and conversation. But once you send this, there's no taking it back. You're talking about rewriting the family narrative. Some stories are private for good reasons. I understood her concern. Iris had grown up with the sanitized version of our family history, the one where Uncle Thorn was a troubled artist who died tragically young, where Aunt Olivia was the strong widow who held everything together through grace and determination. In that version, we were sympathetic characters in a sad but ultimately noble story about resilience and recovery. But stories, I had learned, are living things. They grow and change depending on who tells them and who listens, and they can become prisons as easily as they become sanctuaries. The story we had been telling about our family had protected us for a while, but it had also isolated us from each other, creating little kingdoms of partial truth where no one could safely speak the whole of their experience. Iris, I said, watching her hands wrap around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth. What do you remember about your uncle's funeral? I remember that it rained, like today. I remember you wearing that navy dress with the pearl buttons, and how you kept your arm around Callum during the service because he was shaking. Do you remember what I said to people when they asked how I was holding up? She thought for a moment. You said you were managing. You said Thorn would have wanted you to be strong for Callum. And did that seem true to you, even then? I was 12, Aunt Leave. I didn't know what true was supposed to look like. But that wasn't entirely accurate, and we both knew it. Children have an instinct for authentic emotion that adults often lose, and Iris had been an unusually observant child. She had noticed things the way I had seemed more tired than devastated. The way I had thrown myself into organising Thorn's papers and settling his affairs with what looked suspiciously like relief rather than grief. I need you to help me distribute this letter, I said. I need you to understand why it matters that people know what really happened here. She set down her coffee cup with the deliberate care of someone buying time to think. And if I refuse, then I'll do it myself, but it would mean a great deal to me to have your support. What about Vera? Have you talked to her about this? Vera thinks I'm making a mistake. She believes some truths are too expensive to tell. Maybe she's right, maybe. But maybe the cost of not telling them is higher. That afternoon, we drove into Belmer together, the windshield wipers keeping time with our conversation as we navigated the narrow roads that wound through the countryside. The town had changed considerably since I was a girl. The old mill buildings converted into artists' studios and coffee shops. The main street lined with boutiques that sold the kind of carefully curated country charm that attracted weekenders from the city. But the core of the place remained recognisable: the white church with its needle spire, the library that had been built with Carnegie money, the post office where Mrs. Henderson had worked for 43 years and knew everyone's business before they received their mail. It was the kind of place where news travelled faster than automobiles and where reputations were both courtesy and inheritance. We stopped first at the copy centre, a small business run by a young man named David who had grown up just streets over from where I was born. He helped us make clean copies of the letter on good paper, treating the task with the gravity of someone who understood he was handling more than simple correspondence. Mrs. Breyer, he said as the machine hummed through. It's work, I hope you don't mind me saying, but my grandmother always spoke very highly of you. She said you had a gift for helping people find their way through difficult times. I thanked him, thinking about how many of the conflicts I had mediated over the years had involved families fractured by secrets and silence. How often the path to resolution required someone to be brave enough to speak the unspeakable. It occurred to me that I was finally applying my professional skills to my personal life, though perhaps 30 years too late. Next, we visited my lawyer, Margaret Ashby, whose office occupied the second floor of a Victorian house that had been Converted to professional suites, Margaret had handled my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since I had decided to update my estate planning after turning 60. She was a woman of my generation who understood the weight of certain decisions and the importance of ensuring that one's final wishes were both clear and legally sound. "Oh, Olivia," she said after reviewing the documents I wanted to change, "I have to ask if you're certain about this. Disinheriting a child is not something that can be easily undone, and given the circumstances, given the circumstances, it seems like the most honest thing I can do. But have you considered the possibility that this might be exactly what Callum wants? That he's pushing you away because he's afraid of being hurt again?" It was a fair question, one that had kept me awake the previous night. Callum had been 17 when his father died, old enough to understand loss, but perhaps too young to understand the complex emotions that surrounded it. He had watched me navigate the aftermath of Thorne's death with what must have seemed like suspicious competence, had seen me make decisions and move forward in ways that probably looked like callousness from his perspective. But there comes a time when even the most compassionate interpretation of someone's behaviour must yield to the reality of its impact. Callum had spent 30 years building a case against me based on incomplete information, and I had spent 30 years allowing him to do so rather than insisting on the full truth. We had both chosen our positions and defended them long past the point where compromise was possible. "Margaret," I said, "I've spent my entire adult life trying to mediate between what people want and what they can actually have. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is make the terms of a relationship clear." She nodded slowly and began drafting the changes to my will. The new document would leave Larkridge Hollow and the bulk of my estate to Iris, with provisions for Lyle's education and a substantial bequest to Vera. Callum would receive only a letter explaining my decision and a small monetary gift enough to acknowledge the relationship, but not enough to suggest anything more than legal obligation. That evening, back at the house, Iris and I sat in the living room addressing envelopes by hand. The list was longer than I had initially planned. Family members scattered across 3 states, all friends from my mediation practice, former neighbours who had known our family during the difficult years. Each envelope represented a choice to trust someone with the full complexity of our story. "Are you going to send one to the newspaper?" Iris asked, her voice carefully neutral. I had been considering this question all day. The Belmar Gazette was a small weekly that focused primarily on local politics, school board meetings, and human interest stories about prize-winning tomatoes and successful fundraisers. But it was also read by virtually everyone in town, including people who had known our family for decades and who had their own theories about what had really happened to Thorne. "I think I am," I said finally, but anonymously. "Let people make their own connections. And if Callum finds out you were behind it, then he'll know his mother was finally brave enough to tell the truth." As we worked, I found myself thinking about the families I'd counselled over the years, how often their disputes centred on different versions of the same events. Children who remembered their parents as absent or critical. Parents who remembered themselves as doing their best under difficult circumstances. Siblings who had experienced the same household as entirely different environments depending on their birth order, their temperament, their position in the family constellation. Truth, I had learned, was often less a single fact than a collection of perspectives that sometimes intersected and sometimes diverged entirely. But there was a difference between acknowledging the subjectivity of experience and allowing lies to masquerade as kindness. The last envelope I addressed was to Callum himself. Inside, along with the letter, I included a copy of his father's final journal entry, the paragraph where Thorne had tried to explain his decision and absolve both Callum and me of responsibility for his choice. It was perhaps the cruelest kindness I could offer, but it was also the most honest. He loved you, I wrote in a brief note attached to the journal excerpt. His leaving was never about what you deserved. It was about what he believed he was capable of giving. When we finished, we had 37 envelopes stacked on the coffee table like a paper monument to the power of words to heal and wound. In equal measure, tomorrow, I would drive them to the post office and commit to whatever consequences followed. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, I felt like the keeper of stories rather than their prisoner the morning I mailed. The letters felt like the beginning of an earthquake that would take days to register on all the seismographs that mattered. I drove into town early, before the breakfast crowd gathered at Mabel's diner and before the commuters headed toward their jobs in the city. The post office sat quiet and dignified in the morning light, its limestone facade weathered by 90 years of New England seasons, but still solid, still reliable in the way that important institutions should be. Mrs. Henderson was arranging mail behind the counter when I entered with my box of envelopes. She had known me since I was a girl delivering messages for my grandmother, had sold me stamps for love letters to Thorne when we were courting, had processed the change of address forms when we moved to Larkridge Hollow as newlyweds. Now she looked at my collection of identical envelopes with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades watching the postal service carry the weight of human need and folly. "That's quite a mailing, Olivia," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who sensed significance but didn't want to pry. "Sometimes a person reaches an age where she feels compelled to set the record straight," I replied, handing over the credit card to pay for postage. She nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, as if the postal service regularly handled the business of late-life truth-telling. "Well," she said, applying stamps with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some mail was more important than others, "I hope it brings you what you're looking for." I drove home through countryside that seemed to shimmer with possibility and dread in equal measure. The letters were beyond my control now, traveling through systems and networks toward destinations where they would either heal or wound, illuminate or destroy. I had mediated enough conflicts to understand that truth was not always therapeutic, that sometimes people preferred their carefully constructed versions of reality to the messier, more complicated facts that lay beneath. But I had also learned that silence could be its own form of cruelty, that protecting people from difficult truths often meant trapping them in relationships built on incomplete information. Callum had spent 30 years believing his mother had somehow engineered his father's abandonment. I had spent 30 years allowing him to believe this rather than sharing the weight of what I actually knew. Neither of us had chosen our positions maliciously, but we had both chosen them, and the distance between us had grown until it felt unbridgeable. Perhaps it was. Perhaps some relationships, no matter how foundational, reach a point where the only honest choice is to acknowledge their failure and release each other from the obligation to keep trying. The first response arrived 3 days later, in the form of Vera appearing at my kitchen door with a basket of honey from her beehives and an expression that could have curdled milk. "Olivia Margaret Breyer," she said, setting the honey on my counter with more force than was strictly necessary. "What in God's name have you done?" I poured coffee for both of us, grateful for the familiar ritual of hospitality even in the face of my oldest friend's disapproval. Vera had always possessed the kind of directness that could be either blessing or curse, depending on whether you were prepared to hear what she had to say. "I told the truth," I said simply. "You told your version of the truth to people who were perfectly content with the version they already had. Were they content? Or were they just afraid to ask questions?" She settled into the chair across from me, her movements carrying the stiffness of someone whose body had spent 7 decades tending bees and gardens and other people's children. "I got your letter yesterday morning. By yesterday afternoon, I'd had phone calls from different people wanting to know if what you wrote was really true and whether I thought you were having some kind of breakdown. This was what I had expected. but hearing it described still sent a flutter of anxiety through my chest. And what did you tell them? I told them that you were the sanest person I'd ever known, and that if you said something happened, they could take it to the bank. She fixed me with the stern look she had perfected during 30 years of teaching 3rd grade. But that doesn't mean I think this was wise. Wisdom and courage aren't always the same thing. Neither are courage and foolishness. We sat in the kind of comfortable hostility that only old friends can manage, each of us certain of our position, but familiar enough with the other's reasoning to understand where it originated. Vera had always been protective of the people she loved, sometimes to the point of wanting to shield them from their own choices. I had always been analytical, sometimes to the point of dissecting problems that might have been better left alone. Tell me about the phone calls, I said, finally. Your cousin Ruth wanted to know if she should do something about you. Your neighbour Mrs. Patterson was very concerned about your mental state. Jim Holbrook, you remember Jim? Married to Sarah who taught piano, he said he always suspected there was more to Thorne's death than people talked about. And what do you think? I think you've opened a box that's going to be very difficult to close. I think people are going to choose sides, and some of them are going to choose sides you don't expect. She was right, of course. I had spent enough years mediating family disputes to understand that when long-held narratives are challenged, people often respond by doubling down on their existing beliefs rather than adjusting them to accommodate new information. Some of my family members would read my letter as evidence that I had finally found the courage to tell a difficult truth. Others would read it as the self-serving revisionism of an old woman trying to justify questionable choices. Have you heard? From Callum, not directly, but Iris called this morning. Apparently, he's been calling everyone in the family trying to warn them about your letter. This, too, was expected but painful to hear confirmed. Callum's career as a political strategist had taught him how to control narratives, how to shape public opinion in advance of potentially damaging revelations. He would be working now to frame my letter as evidence of my unreliability rather than his incomplete understanding of our family history. What's he saying? That you've always resented him for not grieving his father the way you thought he should. That you're trying to rewrite history to make yourself look better. That this is your way of punishing him for establishing boundaries around your relationship. Each accusation felt like a small blade, finding the spaces between my ribs. They weren't entirely untrue. I had been frustrated by Callum's refusal to engage with the complexities of his father's struggles, had wished he could see beyond his own hurt to understand the impossible position Thorne's death had put us all in. But the accusation that stung most was the suggestion that I was punishing him for establishing boundaries. I had spent my career helping people understand the difference between healthy boundaries and emotional walls, between protecting yourself and cutting yourself off from the possibility of connection. Callum's declaration that I was dead to him hadn't felt like boundary setting. It had felt like amputation. Vera, I said, do you think I made a mistake? She considered this for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug in a way that reminded me of the careful handling required for working with bees. I think you made a choice. Whether it was a mistake depends on what you were hoping to accomplish. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was hoping to stop carrying his father's secrets. And have you? I thought about this question for the rest of the day. The letters were sent, the truth was circulating, the carefully maintained narrative of our family had been cracked, open like an egg. But I still felt the weight of Thorne's journal in my desk drawer, still woke some mornings expecting to find him pacing the hallway or staring out windows at horizons that seemed perpetually out of reach. Perhaps some burdens couldn't be laid down simply by sharing them. Perhaps the real work was learning to carry them differently, with compassion rather than guilt, with understanding rather than regret. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, Lyle appeared at my kitchen door. He looked older than he had just a few days earlier, as if the knowledge contained in my letter had accelerated some natural process of maturation. His camera hung around his neck like a talisman, and I wondered what he had been documenting in the days since our conversation, Grandma Leave. His voice carried the careful tone of someone approaching a potentially explosive situation. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think my dad will ever forgive you for this?" It was the question I had been avoiding, the one that would determine whether my choice to tell the truth had been an act of love or an act of abandonment. "I don't know, Lyle. I hope someday he'll understand why I felt it was necessary. But you did it anyway, even knowing he might not." "I did. That must have been really hard." I looked at this boy who carried his grandfather's artistic sensitivity and his father's analytical mind, who was old enough to understand the complexity of family relationships, but young enough to believe they could still be repaired, and felt something ease in my chest. "The hardest thing I've ever done," I admitted, "but also the most honest." 2 weeks after the letters were mailed, the Belmar Gazette published my anonymous submission under the headline "A Mother's Truth." When silence becomes its own form of cruelty, I had driven into town early that Thursday morning to pick up a copy before anyone else could see my reaction to seeing our family's private pain transformed into public discourse. Reading my own words in newsprint felt surreal, like watching a home movie of your life projected onto a movie screen for strangers to analyze. The editor had run it as a letter to the editor rather than a news story, which gave it a more personal tone, but also made it clear that these were the opinions of an individual rather than verified facts. Still, the impact was immediate and far-reaching. By noon, Iris had called 3 times. Vera had driven over with a thermos of coffee and a grim expression, and Mrs. Patterson from next door had appeared at my front door with a casserole and barely contained curiosity. "I just wanted to say," Mrs. Patterson said, balancing the covered dish while trying to peer over my shoulder into the house, "that I think you're very brave to tell your story. Harold always said there was something not quite right about how your husband died, though of course we never wanted to pry. This was the peculiar mathematics of small-town life. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but there was an elaborate social protocol around acknowledging that knowledge. People could spend decades speculating about their neighbours' private lives while maintaining the fiction that they were too polite to notice anything unusual." "Thank you for the casserole," I said, accepting the dish without offering the invitation into my house that she was clearly hoping for. "Of course, dear. And if you need anything at all during this difficult time, double quotes." She left the offer hanging like bait, but I simply thanked her again and closed the door. I had spent enough years navigating the delicate social ecosystem of Belmar to recognize fishing expeditions disguised as concern. The real responses came in the following days, in the form of phone calls, letters, and unexpected visits from family members I hadn't heard from in years. Some were supportive, praising my courage in speaking difficult truths. Others were skeptical, questioning my motives or suggesting that some stories were better left untold. A few were angry, accusing me of betraying family loyalty for the sake of public attention. But the response that mattered most, or rather, the absence of response, came from Callum. 3 weeks passed without a word from him, though I heard through Iris that he had hired a lawyer to explore the possibility of contesting my will on the grounds of diminished mental capacity. "He's telling people you've become obsessed with rewriting history," Iris reported during one of our morning coffee sessions. "He says the stress of aging has made you paranoid and vindictive." This strategy was both predictable and painful. Callum had always been skilled at identifying his opponents' weaknesses and exploiting them, a talent that had served him well in his political career, but was devastating when applied to family relationships. By questioning my mental competence, he could dismiss my letter without having to engage with its contents. "Have you talked to him directly?" I asked. I tried. He said I was enabling your delusions by helping you distribute the letter. And what did you say? I told him that I remembered Uncle Thorne too, and that your description of those final months rang true to me. I told him that sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our childhood need to be updated when we become adults. I felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had somehow maintained her capacity for both loyalty and independent thought. Who could love us all without requiring us to be perfect or simple? That afternoon, I decided to visit Callum's old room, something I hadn't done since converting most of the house's bedrooms into spaces for guests and storage. The room still held traces of his adolescence, a bookshelf lined with science fiction novels and photography manuals, a desk where he had written high school essays and college applications, walls that had once been covered with pictures of musicians and athletes and friends whose names I had long forgotten. But tucked in the back of his desk drawer, I found something that stopped me cold. A photograph from his 16th birthday party, torn cleanly in half. One piece showed Callum blowing out candles on a cake, his face bright with the unself-conscious joy of someone who still believed his family was intact. The other piece showed Thorne and me standing behind him, Thorne's hand on Callum's shoulder, and my hand on Thorne's arm, a tableau of familial unity that must have felt like mockery after Thorne's death a year later. The tear was precise, separating Callum from his parents as cleanly as his father's death had separated us all from the life we thought we were building together. I wondered when he had torn it, whether it had been in a moment of anger immediately after the funeral or during one of the quieter moments when grief manifested as the need to edit painful memories from the visible record of his life. Looking at that torn photograph, I finally understood something that had eluded me for 30 years. Callum's anger at me wasn't really about the choices I had made in the aftermath of Thorne's death. It was about the fact that I had survived that death emotionally, practically, spiritually, in ways that made his own struggles feel like weakness, rather than natural responses to loss. He had been 17 when his father died, old enough to understand that Thorne had chosen to leave, but not old enough to understand the complex mental health issues that had driven that choice. All he could see was that his father had preferred death to continued life with his family, and that his mother had seemed to accept this preference with suspicious grace dotting his torn photograph. I saw the moment when he had decided that loving me was too dangerous, that allowing himself to depend on someone who could survive such devastating loss meant risking abandonment again. Better to reject me before I could reject him. Better to declare me dead to him before I could prove that his love wasn't worth staying alive for. This insight should have brought relief or understanding, or at least the satisfaction of finally solving a puzzle that had consumed 3 decades of my emotional energy. Instead, it brought a profound sadness. I had spent 30 years defending choices that were essentially defensible, but I had never understood that Callum wasn't really questioning my choices. He was questioning his own worth. That evening, I called Margaret Ashby to discuss the legal challenges Callum might be preparing to mount against my will. He could try to prove diminished capacity, she explained, but it would be difficult given your recent public appearances, your clear communication about your reasons for the changes, and the fact that multiple witnesses can attest to your mental acuity. And if he succeeds, then the previous version of your will would be reinstated, and he would inherit as originally planned. But Olivia, I have to ask, if this goes to court, it will become very public. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I thought about the torn photograph upstairs, about the careful way Callum had edited his family history to protect himself from further loss, about the decades we had both spent building fortifications around our respective versions of the truth. Margaret, I said, I've spent 30 years avoiding scrutiny. I think I can handle a little more. But even as I said it, I wondered if I was finally reaching the limits of what courage could accomplish, if there were some relationships that couldn't be healed, no matter how much truth was brought to bear on them. The next morning brought in Unexpected visitor, Lyle, arriving before school with his camera and an expression of determined seriousness that reminded me powerfully of his grandfather. "Grandma leave," he said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his usual spot during our conversations. "I want to ask you about something, but I need you to promise you'll tell me the truth." "I promise. Did my grandfather kill himself?" Because of something I did, the question hit me like a physical blow. I had spent so much time thinking about Callum's need for answers that I had never considered what questions Lyle might be carrying about his grandfather's death. "Lyle, no. Absolutely not. You were 3 years old when your grandfather died. Nothing you did or didn't do had anything to do with his choice. But Dad said once that Grandpa Thorne got worse after I was born. That having a grandson made him realize how much he had failed as a father. This was perhaps the cruelest interpretation Callum could have put on his father's death, and I felt a surge of anger at him for burdening a child with such a toxic inheritance. "Your grandfather struggled with depression long before you were born," I said carefully. "If anything, you brought him joy during a very dark time. I remember him taking pictures of you, teaching you to identify birds in the garden. You were one of the few things that could still make him smile. Then why did he leave?" "Because sometimes people's minds get sick in ways that make them believe terrible things about themselves. Your grandfather believed the world would be better without him in it. He was wrong, but his illness made it impossible for him to see that." Lyle took a picture of me as I was speaking, the camera clicking at the moment when I said he was wrong. Later, when he showed me the photograph, I would see something in my expression that surprised me. Not just sadness or regret, but a kind of fierce protectiveness that suggested I was finally ready to fight for the truth, rather than simply endure its absence. The formal legal challenge arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 month after the publication of my letter in the Belmo Gazette. The envelope bore the letterhead of Callum's law firm, a prestigious practice in Boston that specialized in estate litigation and family law. Inside, 23 pages of legal language that essentially argued I was no longer competent to make decisions about my own property due to documented evidence of paranoid ideation, vindictive behavior toward family members, and a pattern of increasingly erratic decision-making inconsistent with previous demonstrated judgment. I read the documents twice, sitting at Thorne's old desk with a cup of coffee that grew cold as I absorbed the methodical destruction of my character and competence. Callum had built his case carefully, interviewing family members and former colleagues, gathering statements from people who had known me for decades and who were now being asked to evaluate my mental state based on a single controversial decision. Some of the evidence was factual, but misleadingly presented. Yes, I had changed my will shortly after a family confrontation. Yes, I had distributed a private letter to dozens of people without their consent. Yes, I had made these decisions without consulting family members who might be affected by them. Other evidence was more subjective. Testimony from relatives who found my letter disturbing or vindictive. Statements from former clients who characterized my recent behavior as uncharacteristic of the mediator they had known. The most painful section dealt with my obsessive focus on past events and my alleged inability to accept responsibility for family dysfunction. Reading Callum's clinical dissection of my choices, I could almost see the logic of his argument. From the outside, my decision to disinherit him and publicize our family's private struggles could indeed look like the actions of someone whose judgment had been compromised by age, grief, or mental illness. But I knew something Callum's lawyers didn't. I had spent 40 years helping people navigate exactly these kinds of family crises, and I recognized the pattern he was following. When people are confronted with truths they don't want to acknowledge, they often respond by attacking the credibility of the truth teller rather than examining the content of the truth itself. I called Margaret Ashby immediately. I was expecting This, she said after I read her selected passages from the filing, it's a standard strategy in will contests. The question is whether Callum can actually prove diminished capacity rather than just questionable judgment. What's the difference? Questionable. Judgment means you made choices other people disagree with. Diminished capacity means you lack the mental ability to understand the consequences of those choices. The first is subjective, the second is medical. And how do we prove mental capacity? Medical evaluations, testimony from people who have interacted with you recently, evidence of your continued ability to manage complex affairs. The burden of proof is actually on Callum to demonstrate incapacity, not on you to prove competence. This was somewhat reassuring, but I knew that legal standards and social realities were often different things, even if I successfully defended my mental competence in court. The process would expose our family's private struggles to public scrutiny in ways that could be permanently damaging. That afternoon, Iris arrived with groceries and an expression of barely controlled fury. "I cannot believe he's doing this," she said, slamming a bag of apples onto the counter with more force than was strictly necessary. "I mean, I can believe it because I know Callum, but I cannot believe it. He's protecting himself the only way. He knows how. He's trying to destroy you rather than deal with his own feelings. Those aren't necessarily different things." She turned to look at me with an expression that reminded me of her mother at that age, fierce, protective, unwilling to let the people she loved diminish themselves in the name of understanding others. "Aunt Leave, you cannot keep making excuses. For him, you cannot keep trying to mediate this conflict as if you're a neutral party instead of someone who's being attacked." She was right, of course. I had spent so many years trying to understand Callum's perspective, trying to find the middle ground between his needs and mine, that I had forgotten how to simply defend my own position. But this legal challenge was different from our previous conflicts. This wasn't a family dispute that could be resolved through better communication or mutual understanding. This was a public assertion that I was no longer competent to make decisions about my own life. What do you think I should do? Fight back. Show everyone who's questioning your judgment exactly how sharp your mind still is. That evening, I began preparing for what would essentially be a trial of my own competence. I gathered financial records showing my continued ability to manage complex investments, correspondence demonstrating clear thinking and communication, medical records from my recent physical exam. I also began making a list of witnesses who could testify to my mental acuity. Margaret Ashby, who had worked with me on multiple legal matters. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had been my physician for 15 years. Former clients who had stayed in touch and could speak to my professional competence. But the most important preparation was internal. I had to decide not just how to defend my choices, but whether I was willing to stand by them even if doing so meant permanently severing my relationship with my son. This was the question that kept me awake during the long October nights as the first frost settled on the gardens and the trees began their annual display of beautiful dying. I had spent 30 years trying to preserve the possibility of reconciliation with Callum, had made countless small compromises and accommodations in the hope that time and patience would eventually heal the wounds left by his father's death. But now I had to consider the possibility that some relationships simply cannot be healed. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop trying to fix what they may not want fixed. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Lyle, who had taken to stopping by after school to work on a photography project about family history. He had been documenting the house, capturing images of rooms where 3 generations of our family had lived and loved and struggled with the complex business of being human together. "Grandma Leave," he said, showing me a photograph he had taken of his grandfather's study. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you could go back and change one thing about how you handled Grandpa Thorne's death, what would it be?" I thought about this question for a long time, looking at the image he had captured of the room where so much of our family's drama played out. The photograph was beautiful, but haunting, capturing both the lingering presence of the man who had worked there and the empty silence he had left behind. I would have insisted on family counseling, I said finally. I would have made sure your father had help processing his grief instead of trying to handle it all within the family. Why didn't you? Because 30 years ago, mental health treatment was more stigmatized than it is now because your father was resistant to the idea. Because I thought love and time would be enough to heal the damage. And now I understand that some wounds require professional help to heal properly. That good intentions aren't always enough. That night, I called Dr. Chen and asked her to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of my mental status for the court proceedings. I also contacted Dr. James Morrison, a geriatric psychiatrist I had worked with on several mediation cases, and asked him to assess my cognitive function and emotional stability. I want there to be no question about my competence, I told him. I want the evaluation to be so thorough that no one can reasonably argue I'm not capable of making decisions about my own life. Oh, Olivia, he said, I have to ask, are you sure this is the battle you want to fight? Family estrangement is painful, but public litigation can be devastating. I'm sure, I said. I've spent too many years letting other people define my story. It's time I stood up for my own version of the truth. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in 20 years, Dr. Sarah Callum, who had been Thorne's psychiatrist during his final months. She had seen the newspaper article and wanted to offer her support. I can't discuss Thorne's treatment specifically, she said, but I can testify that your decision to allow the official cause of death to remain accidental drowning was consistent with the recommendations I made at the time. We both believe that Callum was too young and traumatized to handle the full truth about his father's mental state. This was the validation I hadn't realized I needed confirmation from a professional that my choices had been reasonable given the circumstances, that my silence had been protective rather than selfish. Would you be willing to testify to that in court? Absolutely. I think what you're going through now is exactly what we were trying to prevent 30 years ago, the weaponization of family tragedy for personal advantage. As I hung up the phone, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I wasn't defending my choices or explaining my motivations. I was simply standing in the truth of my experience and allowing others to decide whether they could accept that truth or not. The battle was far from over, but I was finally ready to fight it. The psychiatric evaluation took place on a cold morning. In early November, in Dr. Morrison's office overlooking the Belmer Town Square, I had dressed carefully for the appointment, choosing clothing that projected competence without suggesting I was trying too hard to appear younger than my 75 years. The office itself was designed to be calming, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being auditioned for the role of my own life. Dr. Morrison conducted a comprehensive assessment that lasted nearly 3 hours. He tested my memory, my reasoning ability, my understanding of abstract concepts. He asked me to explain my recent decisions, to describe my relationships, to discuss my understanding of the potential consequences of changing my will. Throughout the evaluation, I felt like I was translating my entire existence into clinical language, reducing a lifetime of complex emotions and difficult choices to data points that could be measured and analyzed. Mrs. Breyer, he said near the end of our session, I want to ask you directly, do you believe your decision to disinherit your son was motivated by anger, by a desire for revenge, or by what you genuinely believe to be in everyone's best interest? It was the question I had been asking myself for weeks, the one that got to the heart of my motivations in ways that legal arguments about competence couldn't touch. All three, I said finally. I was angry at Callum for rejecting me so completely. I wanted him to understand that words have consequences, that declaring someone dead to you is not a choice you can unmake without effort. But mostly, I believe that continuing to leave him my estate, while he maintained that I was dead to him, was enabling a relationship that was toxic for both of us. And now, do you still believe that? More than ever, this legal challenge has convinced me that Callum sees me not as a person with my own needs and perspectives, but as an object that should behave according to his expectations. He's not trying to repair our relationship, he's trying to control it. Double quotes. Dr. Morrison made notes for several minutes before looking up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Breyer, in my professional opinion, you demonstrate no signs of cognitive impairment, delusional thinking, or diminished capacity. Your decision-making process, while perhaps controversial, reflects clear understanding of consequences and consistent values. You may be many things, but you are not incompetent. The relief I felt was overwhelming. For weeks, I had been second-guessing myself, wondering if Callum might be right about my deteriorating judgment. To hear a professional confirm that my thinking was sound, that my choices reflected reasonable decision-making rather than mental decline, felt like being granted permission to trust my own experience again. But the real test would come in court, where Dr. Morrison's evaluation would be weighed against the testimony of family members and the arguments of Callum's legal team. The hearing was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 2 months after I had mailed my letter, and for months after Callum had declared me dead to him. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I found myself becoming something of a local celebrity. In Belmar, people who had known me for decades suddenly wanted to share their opinions about family loyalty, estate planning, and the rights of elderly parents to make their own decisions. Some were supportive, praising my courage in speaking difficult truths. Others were critical, suggesting that I had violated unspoken rules about keeping family business private. The most unexpected source of support came from other older women who had faced similar challenges with their adult children. They began stopping by the house, calling on the phone, sharing their own stories of estrangement and reconciliation and the complex negotiations required to maintain dignity while loving people who might not love you back. My daughter didn't speak to me for 5 years, said Eleanor Hartwell, a woman I knew from church but had never been particularly close to. She thought I had favoured her brother, that I had damaged her by not protecting her from his bullying. When they were children, maybe I had. Maybe some of her anger was justified. But I couldn't keep apologising for choices I'd made with the best information I had at the time. These conversations helped me understand that my situation, while particularly public and legally complicated, was not unique. Many families carried secrets and resentments across generations, and many parents reached a point where they had to choose between their children's comfort and their own integrity. Iris had become my primary support during this period, helping me organise documents for the hearing and serving as a buffer between me and the more intrusive members of our extended family. She had also been documenting the entire process with her filmmaker's eye, creating what she described as an archive of truth-telling that might someday help other families navigate similar challenges. Are you going to turn this into a documentary? I asked her one afternoon as she filmed me reviewing legal papers. I'm thinking about it. With your permission, of course. I think there's a story here about the cost of silence and the courage required to speak truth, even when the timing is terrible. And if we lose the case, if the court decides I'm incompetent, then we'll document that too. Sometimes the most important stories are about people who stood up for their principles, even when the world told them they were wrong. A week before the hearing, Lyle arrived with news that shifted the entire landscape of our conflict. Grandma leave, he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering information that might explode. I need to tell you something about my dad. I waited, watching this 17-year-old boy struggle with knowledge that seemed too heavy for his shoulders. He's been seeing a therapist for the past month, since your letter came out. And yesterday, he asked me if I thought you would be willing to talk to him. This was the development I'd hoped for and feared in equal measure. I had wanted Callum to engage with the deeper issues underlying our conflict, but I had also prepared myself for the possibility that our relationship was beyond repair. What did you tell him? I told him that you've been waiting to talk to him for 30 years, but that talking and listening aren't the same thing. And what did he say? He said he was starting to understand the difference. That evening, I received a phone call that would change everything. Callum's voice was quiet, formal, carrying none of the warmth I remembered from his childhood, but also none of the cold anger that had characterized our recent interactions. "Mother," he said, and the fact that he used that word instead of my first name felt significant. "I'm calling to ask if you would be willing to postpone the court hearing. I think we need to have some conversations before we let lawyers decide our family's future." I sat in the chair by the phone, looking out at the garden where this whole crisis had begun, and felt something that might have been hope beginning to unfurl in my chest. "I'm willing to talk, Callum. I've always been willing to talk. I know. I think that's what I'm finally beginning to understand." We agreed to meet the following Saturday at Larkridge Hollow, with Lyle present as what he called a witness to whatever truth we can manage to tell each other. I hung up the phone and sat in the gathering darkness, wondering if it was possible to build a new relationship on the ruins of an old one, if two people could find their way back to each other after 30 years of miscommunication and hurt. I didn't know the answer, but for the first time in months, I believed it might be worth finding out. The day Callum came home was December 12th, 3 days before a scheduled court hearing and exactly for months after he had declared me dead. To him in the garden, I watched from the kitchen window as his car wound up the long driveway, the same black sedan he had driven to my birthday party, but somehow looking different now. Less like an invasion and more like a tentative approach to neutral territory. He sat in the car for several minutes after parking, and I could see him looking at the house where he had grown up, perhaps seeing it differently than he had in years. Larkridge Hollow in winter had a particular beauty, the Victorian architecture softened by snow, and the bare trees revealing the bones of the landscape in ways that summer's abundance concealed. It was a house built for permanence, for the kind of family continuity that my generation had believed was both possible and essential. When he finally knocked on the door, I opened it to find a man who looked older than his 48 years, as if the months of conflict had aged him in ways that natural time could not. His political strategist confidence had been replaced by something more tentative, more human. "Mother," he said again, the word still careful, but warmer than it had been on the phone. "Callum, come in. You must be cold." The ritual of hospitality gave us something to do with our hands and voices while we navigated the strange territory of being in the same room again. I made coffee. He hung his coat in the closet. We both commented on the weather as if we were distant relatives meeting at a funeral, rather than mother and son attempting to repair 3 decades of accumulated damage. Lyle arrived as we were settling in the living room, carrying his camera and the carefully mended photograph I had found in Callum's old bedroom. He had spent hours with tape and patience, reconstructing the torn image so that the family appeared whole again, though the seams of repair were still visible if you knew where to look. "I thought we might need this," he said, placing the photograph on the coffee table between us like evidence in a trial, where everyone was both plaintiff and defendant. Callum looked at the picture for a long time, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I remember tearing this. It was the night after Dad's funeral, when I was going through my room trying to decide what to keep and what to throw away. I couldn't stand looking at us all together, knowing it would never be like that again. But you kept both pieces," I observed. I kept everything. Even the things that hurt to look at. He paused, then looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. I think I've been keeping everything that hurt for 30 years, and I didn't know how to let any of it go. This was the conversation I had been hoping for since his father died. The moment when we might finally address the real substance of our conflict rather than dancing around its edges. But now that it was happening, I felt unprepared for the vulnerability it required. Callum, I said carefully, I want you to know that I've read your legal challenge to my will. I understand why you believe I've been making poor decisions. I don't anymore. I mean, I disagree with your decisions, but I don't think you're incompetent. I think you're finally doing what you should have done 30 years ago, which is refusing to let me punish you for Dad's choice to leave. The admission hung in the air between us like something fragile that could be destroyed by the wrong word or gesture. I had spent decades trying to understand Callum's anger, and here he was naming it more clearly than I had ever been able to. I blamed you, he continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in this new territory of honesty. Not just for letting him die, but for surviving it so well. For being able to move on when I couldn't, for making it look like losing him wasn't the end of the world when it felt like the end of mine. It was the end of my world too, I said quietly. I just couldn't let it be the end of yours, but maybe it needed to be. Maybe I needed to fall apart completely before I could figure out how to put myself back together. Lyle had been taking pictures throughout our conversation, documenting this attempt at family reconstruction with the same careful attention he brought to all his artistic projects. Now he set down his camera and spoke for the first time since arriving. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you remember the last thing Grandpa Thorne said to you? Callum's face went very still. This was clearly a question he had been avoiding for 30 years. He said, ... double quotes. Callum stopped, started again. He said he was sorry he hadn't been a better father, and that he hoped someday I would understand that leaving wasn't about not loving us. And did you? Understand? I mean, no. I decided he was lying, that if he really loved us he would have found a way to stay. But now I have a son of my own. And I understand that love and capability aren't the same thing. That you can love someone completely and still believe they're better off without you. I felt tears starting, the first I had cried since this whole ordeal began. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but tears of release, of finally being able to grieve. Not just for Thorne's death, but for all the years Callum and I had spent locked in our separate versions of that loss. I should have gotten you therapy, I said. I should have insisted, regardless of what you wanted. I should have asked for help instead of deciding that needing help was weakness. I should have told you the truth about your father's state of mind. I should have asked questions instead of making assumptions. We could have continued this litany of regrets indefinitely, but Lyle interrupted with the wisdom of someone who understood that acknowledgement was more important than exhaustive cataloguing. What do we do now? He asked. I looked at my son. This man I had carried and raised and lost and mourned and loved and feared for 48 years, and realized that I didn't know how to rebuild a relationship from scratch. But I knew how to take first steps. I'm going to ask the court to dismiss your challenge to my will, I said. Not because I'm changing my mind about the inheritance, but because this isn't something that should be decided by lawyers, and I'm going to withdraw the challenge, Callum replied. Because even if I don't understand your decision, I respect your right to make it. What about the house, the estate? I think Iris and Lyle should have it. They're the ones who never stopped believing this family could be healed. That afternoon, we called our respective lawyers and began the process of ending our legal battle. Before it had properly begun, the hearing scheduled for December 15th was cancelled, the challenge was withdrawn, and the new will would stand as written. But more importantly, we began the much longer process of learning how to be family again. Not the family we had been before Thorn died, which was impossible, and not the family we had pretended to be afterward, which was unsustainable, but something new and more honest. Callum started coming to dinner on Sundays, bringing his wife, and Lyle and sometimes other family members who had been caught in the middle of our conflict. We talked about Thorn more openly, sharing memories that included both his gifts and his struggles. We talked about the choices we had all made in the aftermath of his death, examining them not for guilt or blame, but for understanding. It wasn't easy. There were conversations that ended in argument, meals that concluded with someone storming out, moments when the weight of 30 years' worth of accumulated hurt threatened to crush our tentative progress. But we kept trying, kept choosing. Connection over protection, truth over comfort. 6 months after my 75th birthday, Iris completed her documentary about our family's journey from estrangement to reconciliation. She called it The Long Game, after my career as a mediator and my belief that some conflicts require years rather than hours to resolve. The film premiered at a small festival in Boston, where it won an audience award and sparked conversations about family secrets, mental health stigma, and the cost of silence. But for me, the real victory was much smaller and more personal. The fact that Callum and I could sit in a theatre together, watching our story unfold on screen, and hold hands. During the difficult parts, on the anniversary of Thorn's death, we went together to visit his grave. It was October again, the trees brilliant with dying and the air sharp with the promise of winter. Callum brought flowers. I brought a letter I had written to Thorn explaining how his family had finally learned to talk about losing him. "Do you think he would be proud of us?" Callum asked as we stood by the simple granite stone that marked his father's resting place. "I think he would be amazed that we figured out how to have the conversations he couldn't have with us when he was alive." "I miss him," Callum said. And it was the first time in 30 years he had been able to say those words without them being followed by anger. "So do I replied. "But I don't miss the silence anymore." As we walked back to the car, I thought about the letter I had written that had started this whole process, about the courage it had taken to tell the truth and the cost of that telling. I thought about families everywhere who were trapped in cycles of silence and misunderstanding, who believed that love meant protecting each other from difficult realities. But mostly, I thought about the photograph that Lyle had mended, how the seams of repair were still visible but no longer seemed like weakness. Some things, when they break, can be made stronger in the places where they were once fractured. Some families, when they finally learn to tell the truth, discover that honesty is not the enemy of love, but its most essential foundation. I was 76 years old, and I was finally learning how to be a mother to a man who was learning how to be my son. It had taken us 30 years and a public battle and more courage than either of us knew we possessed. But we had found our way back to each other. The long game, as it turned out, was the only game worth playing. The snow that year came late. By the time the first flurries brushed the gables of Larkridge Hollow, Olivia Bry had already begun the slow process of turning the house from a fortress of memory into a space of renewal. Grief still lingered in the creaking floorboards and dusty bookshelves, but it no longer dictated the architecture of her days. She had made good on her promise to herself, to Lyle, and in some stubborn way, even to Thorn. The will had stood unchallenged. The letter had travelled further than she had ever imagined, and Callum had come home. But home had become an idea that required new foundations. Olivia stood on the wide porch one December morning, watching workers dismantle the rotted greenhouse at the edge of the property. For years, it had been a monument to Thorn's failed attempt at gardening, a metaphor too obvious even for a man who had built his career on literary symbolism. Now, under the watch of a small construction crew and Vera's reluctant blessing, it was becoming a community gathering space. Open air, circular, meant for dialogue, not courtrooms. Not journals, not whispered justifications, conversations, Larkridge. House of mediation, Iris had said, her camera hanging from her neck like a locket. A place where people come to face the stories they've outlived. That had been Olivia's vision. To those she would have said it more plainly, it was time for the house to be useful again. To serve a purpose other than keeping ghosts warm. She hadn't expected the funding to come from Callum. It was early November when she received the email. No apology, no preamble, just a PDF attachment and a one-line message. I think this will cover the framework. If not, let me know. See. The document was a transfer of $75,000 to a joint venture in Iris's name, earmarked for renovation, expansion, and community trust initiatives. It was the kind of gesture only someone raised in politics could execute. Elegant, indirect, effective. When she called him that evening, his voice was measured, but softer than it had been in years. I don't know what else to say, he admitted. You don't have to say anything. You acted. That matters more. There was a pause. I want Lyle to believe that I can build something other than barriers, he said. And that was that. The money arrived in full by week's end. Olivia never asked how he'd moved it so fast. Political strategists with super PAC contacts had their ways. She didn't need to know. What mattered was that he had stopped trying to rewrite her choices and started writing his own dart. It had been for months since the Gazette published her anonymous letter, and the ripples still reached her mailbox each week. Some were from old clients who now felt brave enough to share their own stories of estranged children, hidden addictions, or final confessions. Others came from strangers, readers from across the state, even across the country, who had stumbled across the piece when it was shared in a viral post titled "The Will That Broke the Silence." One, from a woman named Belinda in rural Ohio, stuck with her. Your story reminded me of my mother, who never told me why my father left. I hated her for it. Now I wonder if she was just doing what she thought was kind. Maybe it's not about who tells the truth first, but who's willing to live with it the longest. There were days Olivia felt overwhelmed by the letters, by how many people had accepted silence as their only inheritance. But most days, she felt resolute. She responded to each one, even if just with a single sentence, "Thank you for sharing your story with me." We're not alone. By spring, the greenhouse had become something else entirely. With Vera's reluctant blessing, "Just don't plant any of those awful ornamental grasses." She'd said the new building had begun to take shape, circular, skylit, furnished not with desks or offices, but low chairs arranged in quiet concentric rings. No podiums, no hierarchy, just space. They named it the Briar Room, not for Olivia, though many assumed it was, but for the symbol the name evoked. Thorns, yes, but also protection. A barrier not to keep things out, but to keep the vulnerable within safe while they grew. The first group that used the space was a grief support circle. Then came a team of teachers trying to resolve a dispute between the PTA and the school board. A month later, a mother and her adult daughter, estranged for 10 years, booked a Sunday session. Iris documented everything, quietly, respectfully. Her camera became less of a lens and more of a witness proof that these attempts at truth-telling were not just noble but possible. This house used to be a story, Iris said during an interview with a local filmmaker. Now it's a library. Of them, one day in April, a man Olivia didn't recognize knocked on her door. Double quotes Ms. Breyer. "My name's Jonathan Lynn. I was your husband's last editor." Thorne's last novel had been published posthumously, a slim, melancholy volume titled Midwinter Confessions. It had sold poorly, like the others. But over the years, it had developed a small cult following among readers who appreciated its aching prose and elliptical structure. "I was cleaning out some files," Lynn said, adjusting his glasses, "and I found something I thought you should." See, it was a letter, not addressed to her, but to Callum. I never sent it, Lynn admitted. It felt too late. And then, maybe, not mine to send. But it feels different now. The letter, written 6 weeks before Thorn's death, was short but brutal in its clarity. Callum, I fear I am not the man you need. I fear I am the man you'll spend years trying to outgrow. But know this, nothing you did made me leave. If I go, it's not to escape you, it's to save you, and that is not fair. But it's the only thing I still have the courage to give. Dad Callum read the letter a week later, alone, in the study where his father had written it. When he emerged, his eyes were red. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, he knew. Olivia didn't ask what he meant. Some truths were private, even for reconciliation. But she did take his hand, and he didn't let go. The fire started with a spark too small to trace. Perhaps it was a loose wire in the East Wing's aging electrical system. Perhaps it was a candle Lyle had lit and forgotten in the study while photographing Thorne's old manuscripts. Or perhaps, though Olivia would never admit this aloud, it was the house itself deciding it was time to let go, whatever its origin. By the time Iris smelled the smoke, the fire had already made its decision. The East Library, where Thorne's books lined the shelves in careful order, where Olivia had written the first draft of her letter on her father's fountain pen, was gone by the time the fire trucks arrived. No one was hurt. But something essential was lost. I should feel something, Olivia said that night, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the edges of her sleeves dusted in ash. But all I feel is ... release. Vera, standing beside her with a mug of bourbon spiked tea, squinted at the skeletal remains of the east wall. Maybe you already mourned what burned. Lyle was inconsolable, not because of the loss of the room he'd already scanned most of the documents, but because of what he hadn't been able to save, the notebooks. Thorne's final, unedited thoughts, ideas for novels that would now remain forever unwritten. Memos in the margins of books he never dared publish. They're gone, he said to Olivia, his voice raw. The last pieces of him. No, she said, drawing him into an embrace that was as much for herself as for him. The last pieces of him are in you. The week after the fire, Iris began the archival project. It started with salvaging what she could, books with singed covers, pages that smelled of smoke, but were still legible, photographs from the walls that had escaped the worst of the flames. Then came the tapes. To Olivia's surprise, Thorne had recorded himself in the final weeks before his death. Not just writing sessions, but spoken letters, conversations with no one. Memos to a version of himself he was no longer certain existed. I didn't know about these, she admitted as Iris gently loaded a cassette into the digital converter. I think he didn't want you to, Iris said, but maybe he wanted me to find them. The first recording was halting, like a man reacquainting himself with language. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it, or maybe it means I did. Maybe survival looks different than I imagined. Olivia ... I want to start with you. They listened in silence as Thorne unravelled his pain in syllables, his fear of being a burden, his shame at not being the father he'd imagined, his guilt over watching Olivia carry a weight that had once been his alone. By the fifth recording, Callum joined them. He didn't cry. He didn't even speak. But when the tape clicked off, he reached across the table and touched the back of Olivia's hand, not grasping, not seeking, just contact. The house had been open for mediation for 5 months before Olivia agreed to host the first public event. It was Iris's idea, a panel called Inherited Silences, When Grief Outlives the Dead. Callum, to everyone's astonishment, including his own, agreed to speak. I don't want to give a speech, he warned Iris. I'm not here to play the prodigal son. You're here because you understand what silence does to a family. She said. There were 60 chairs in the Briar Room. Everyone was filled. Some attendees came from as far as Maine and Pennsylvania. Having read about the project in local features or seen clips from Iris's documentary, the event was structured like a conversation. Olivia, Callum, Lyle, and Iris sat in a semicircle, not elevated above the audience but on the same level. They took questions, they answered honestly. They disagreed in public. At one point, a woman asked Callum, "What finally made you forgive her?" He shook his head. "I didn't," he said. "Forgiveness isn't the right word. I accepted her. And then I let her accept me. And that was enough. It has to be." Another audience member asked Olivia if she regretted disinheriting her son. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary," she said. "But not the act itself. It was a kind of punctuation we both needed." Lyle, quiet for most of the event, finally spoke when someone asked how families could begin having hard conversations. "You start by talking to yourself," he said. "You say the hardest thing you've never said out loud. And if it breaks you, good. Now you know where to begin." By early summer, the house had become a pilgrimage site. Not in the religious sense, though a few guests left folded prayers between the bricks of the old fireplace, but in the way certain places become necessary for people trying to speak what they've never been allowed to. Some brought letters. Olivia started collecting them in a wooden box on the front table. "Leave something behind," the sign read, "so you can carry something new away." The letters came from siblings who hadn't spoken in 20 years. From mothers who missed their daughters, but didn't know how to say "I was wrong." From fathers who left and wanted to know if return was still allowed. Iris wanted to film them, but Olivia said no. "These are sacred," she said. "Not scenes, not statements. Grief doesn't owe us a monologue." Instead, they curated a selection into a book, anonymous, untitled, bound in ash grey linen and set out in the briar room for guests to read. It became, unexpectedly, the most borrowed book in the house. 1 year after the fire, Olivia invited her lawyer, Margaret Ashby, back to Larkridge Hollow, not to amend her will, but to rewrite her legacy. "I don't want to pass down money," she said. "Not just money. I want to pass down an ethic." Together, they drafted what Olivia called the Living Bequest, a trust fund not just for Iris and Lyle, but for the ongoing operations of the Briar Room. The trust stipulated that every year, the house would sponsor 10 families who couldn't afford mediation, therapy, or reconciliation work. The only requirement, Olivia said, is that they're willing to talk. Callum helped finalise the legal structure. Iris managed the fund. Lyle designed the brochure and built the website. Thorne's name was never mentioned in the documents, but his handwriting appeared in the logo, the word Briar, drawn from one of his notebooks, scanned and stitched into the house's new identity. The last page of Iris's second documentary, Inheritance of Flame, is a still image. It shows Olivia standing in the rebuilt garden, holding Thorne's old journal in one hand and Lyle's camera in the other. The caption reads, "Some legacies aren't passed down. They're wrestled from the fire, rebuilt with every conversation, and handed forward in pieces." Not to preserve, but to repair, Olivia Briar's final full year of life was, by her own account, the quietest she had ever lived. Not uneventful. There were still letters, still mediations hosted in the Briar Room, still tensions and reconciliations among guests who found their way to Larkridge Hollow, but in her personal life, peace had finally settled like dust in an old study. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared and refused to be moved. That winter, she stopped making lists. For decades, she had carried notebooks filled with daily priorities, court sessions, planned reconciliations, and later, drafts of letters never sent. But in that final year, her calendar remained mostly blank. She woke with the sun. She cooked what she felt like eating. She read old novels. She did not try to save anyone. When Iris asked her why she no longer wrote anything down, Olivia smiled and said, "I've been archiving the truth so long. I forgot how to simply live it. She wore her late husband's cardigan without bitterness. She had tea with Vera every Thursday, even when they disagreed. And when Lyle turned 18, she gave him Thorne's fountain pen, wrapped in soft cloth and quiet pride. I trust what you'll write with it, she said, even if it's not about us. Callum came often, but never unannounced. That was the agreement. Boundaries, honoured and intact. One day in May, he arrived with a gift, a single wooden box, plain but beautifully crafted, with a brass latch and a key. For you, he said. Not because of anything I need, just because you've earned it, inside. Were dozens of Polaroids, pictures Callum had taken throughout the last year of Olivia tending the roses, of Lyle asleep under an open window, of Vera laughing mid-sentence. No captions, just moments. I used to think documenting something was the same as understanding it, he said. But lately, I think some things only become clear when you stop trying to interpret them. Olivia ran her fingers across each image like they were braille tactile, silent, legible only through memory. They're beautiful, she said. I never meant to punish you, he replied softly. I just didn't know how to love you without needing answers. You don't need answers anymore. I just need time. She reached across the table and took his hand. Well, she said, that we still have. Olivia died in her sleep on the first night of November, with rain tapping gently at the windows and a book half finished on her lap. No drama, no decline, just stillness, a final paragraph, gently punctuated. It was Iris who found her, just past dawn. There was number note, no last confession. But there was the letter she had written to her family a month earlier, sealed in an envelope, titled Only When the Time Comes. To those I've loved and those I've failed, while trying to love you the best way I knew how. If you are reading this, I'm gone. Don't bury me in silence. Don't canonize me with forgetfulness. Tell the truth. Tell it kindly if you can, but tell it even when it hurts. Especially then. I've made peace with the fact that not all wounds close, that some heal raggedly, that some scars become tattoos we didn't choose, but eventually find meaning in. My wish is not that you forgive everything, only that you remember the parts worth keeping. Tell better stories. Olivia Eris turned the Briar Room into a year-round mediation retreat, offering free stays to families in crisis. She preserved Olivia's study just as it had been: journal, cardigan, letter opener, and all open to visitors who needed a quiet place to write what they were afraid to say out loud. The letters still arrived. Now, more than ever, she published a book titled The Quiet Season, Lessons from a Family That Chose to Speak. It wasn't about Olivia. Not exactly, but her presence wove through it like a watermark. Lyle declined a full scholarship to study photography in New York. I don't want to study moments, he said. I want to witness them. He stayed at Larkridge Hollow and became the youngest certified mediator in the state. He specialized in adult children and aging parents. I don't fix anyone, he told his clients. I just remind them that silence is a choice. And so is speaking. One of his photos, a black and white image of the fireplace in Olivia's study, with only the letter opener lit by morning light, won a regional art award. He titled it Inheritance. Callum, in his own time, returned to politics not as a strategist, but as an advocate for mental health legislation. He started a fund in his father's name, offering support for adult children of parents lost to suicide. He never remarried, but he rebuilt his relationship with Lyle one boundary at a time. I thought forgiveness was an act, he told a room full of college students during a guest lecture. But it turns out it's more like architecture. Quiet, daily, unfinished. 1 year after Olivia's death, the family held a remembrance in the Briar Room, not a funeral, not a memorial, just a circle. Vera brought honey. Iris brought the documentary. while brought a stack of blank postcards and asked each guest to write a single sentence they wished they could say to someone they had lost. Callum read from Olivia's letter. And then they all sat quietly. The air was warm with sunlight and the low murmur of garden wine through open windows. In the centre of the circle, on a small table, sat Olivia's wooden box of letters, unlocked, available. A young girl stood, shy and unsure, and walked toward it. She placed her postcard on the pile. Then she turned and spoke. "I never knew Olivia," she said. "But I think she left a place where truth doesn't have to arrive perfect, just willing." They all nodded. And in that moment, Olivia Bry, mother, widow, mediator, truth teller, became not just memory, she became method. She became a way forward. Up next we have to more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.